In this video, we're going to talk about evaluating composition functions. So now instead of actually finding the composition function, we're actually going to plug in values and evaluate them. So notice now instead of having x's here, we have values here that we're going to plug in. So we have 4 parts to this example 1. We're going to start off with g of f of 2. So that means I'm going to take f of 2 and I'm going to plug it into the function g. So let's do this in reg so you can see the difference. Since f is on the right in the first part, when I rewrite it, I'm going to have g of f of 2. F of 2 is going to be on the right and g is going to be on the left. So I got to find f of 2. If I plug 2 into my function f, I'm going to get the square root of 7 because 2 times 2 is 4, plus 3 is 7, and I'm left with the square root of 7. So I'm going to replace f of 2 with the square root of 7. Now I'm going to take the square root of 7 and plug it into my g function. So my g function is 1/2 times x. So when I take the square root of 7 and plug it into that x, I get the square root of 7 over 2. So now I'm going to take and find g of h of -4. So that means I'm going to take my function g and I'm going to plug in h of -4. So I need to find h of -4 first and then plug that into my g function. So I'm going to look at my h function, which is x squared. And when I plug in -4 times -4 is 16. So h of -4 is 16. So now I'm going to replace h of -4 with 16. So now I take my 16 and plug it in for my g function. And then when I take 1/2 times 16, that gives me 8. Okay, the third part is h of f of 23. That means I'm going to find f of 23 and plug that whole thing, f of 23, whatever I get for that, and plug it into my h function. So when I look at my function, f of x, when I plug in 23 for x, that's 2 times 23, which is 46, and when I add 3, that gives me 49. And I can take the square root of 49, that's 7. So I'm going to replace f of 23 with 7. But now I'd have to take 7 and plug it into h. H is x squared, so when I take the 7 and plug it into the x squared, that gives me 49. Okay, last example, I have 3 functions that I'm composing. So it's the same thing we've been doing. We're just going to do it with 3 functions now. So f is going to be on the outside, g is going to be in the middle, and then h of -1 is going to be on the very inside. That's going to be the innermost function. So we're going to start with h of -1 first. So I'm going to find h of -1. So I'm going to take -1 and plug it into the x squared, which is a positive 1. So I'm going to replace that h of -1 with a 1. Now I'm going to take the 1 and plug it into the g. If I take 1 and plug it into g, that gives me a 1/2. So now I'm going to replace g of 1 with 1/2. And now I'm going to take 1/2 and plug it into f. Well, if I take a 1/2 and plug it into x, into f, my function f, that gives me 2 times a 1/2, which is 1. 1 plus 3 is 4, and the square root of 4 is 2. So that would be my final answer for f of g of h. Okay, so that would be evaluating composition functions if you're given the formula. But remember, there's other representations of functions. So now we're going to look at using tables. So notice that this is my table for f, and this is my table for g. So when I'm looking to evaluate f, I want to look at my table that I marked in red. And when I'm looking to evaluate g, I want to look at my table marked in green. So for the first part of this question, it says find f of g of 3. So that means I need to find g of 3 and plug it into f. So this is what we're looking at first. Since we're looking to evaluate g first, I'm going to look at the table that I marked in green because that's labeled as g. And I'm going to look and find the value of g when x is 3, which would be 4. So I'm going to replace that g of 3 with a 4. Now I'm going to find f of 4. So now I'm going to look at the red table, which is marked as f of x. So when I look at x is 4, f is going to be 6. So my final answer will be 6 for that. The second part is g of f of 5. So I'm going to find f of 5 first. And let's see, since I'm finding f, I'm going to look at the red table. And I want to find the value of f when x is 5. So that would be 7. So I'm going to replace f of 5 with 7. But now I'm looking at the green table because now I got to evaluate g. So now I'm going to look at when x is 7, g is 12. So my final answer is going to be 12. So now let's do f of g of 5. So I need to find g of 5 first. So I'm going to look at the g table. I'm going to look at x is 5 and I'm going to get 8. So now I got to find f of 8. And f of 8 does not exist. Right? There's no value of y when x is 8. So last question, g of 3. So I need to evaluate g twice. I'm going to find g of 3, which would be 4. So I'm replacing g of 3 with 4. And then I got to look back at the g table again. And when g is 4, when x is 4, g is 6. So my final answer would be 6 for that. Okay, last representation, we're looking at graphs. So this graph here on the left is g of x, and the graph on the right is f of x. So those are the two graphs we're going to use to make our evaluations. So if I want to find f of g of -1, first I need to find g of -1 and plug it into f. So I need to look at my graph of g. At -1, that would be right here, g is 3. And so now I got to take 3 and plug it into f. So now I'm looking at the graph on the right. So if I look at 3 here and come up, f of 3 is also 3. So that would be my final answer for f of g of -1. So now let's look at g of f of 3. So I got to find f of 3 first and then plug that into g. Well, f means I'm going to look at my graph on the right. And at 3, that's this point here, my value for f is 3. So I got to find g of 3 now. Right, I'm replacing f of 3 with 3. Now I got to find g of 3. So now I'm looking at the graph on the left because we're dealing with g. And when I look at 3, 1, 2, 3, that's going to be 1. So my final answer for g of f of 3 would be 1. Now let's do g of f of 0. So that means I got to find f of 0. So I'm looking at the graph on the right, my f graph. F of 0 would be -2. And now I got to look at the graph on the left to evaluate g of -2. And g of -2 would be 0. That would be this point right here. So my final answer for g of f of 0 is 0. Okay, last example for graphing. We're going to use f of g of 0 as our last example. So now we're doing the same as this previous one here, but we're switching the order. So we're going to do f of g of 0, which means I need to find g of 0 first. G of 0 would be 2. That would be this point right here. And now I got to find f of 2, which would be this point right here, which would be 2. So my final answer for f of g of 0 would be 2.